The Trump administration, with its approach to science and climate change, has all the makings of a foreign policy disaster, says Foreign Policy magazine this week. At best, some writers have called it brilliant incoherence. At worst, other diplomacy thinkers warn that it raises serious doubts about the United States' commitment to its agreements related to climate change and potentially other areas as well. Commentary in the Japan Times calls on the G20 to work together to overcome the American resistance, and the Financial Times reported that the European Union has offered flexible interpretations of the Paris Climate Agreement that allows the United States flexibility to chart its own path. Many other nations, from Nigeria to the Caribbean and Jamaica to Fiji, and other sinking Pacific islands, are trying to plan and prepare for climate hazards themselves. A prominent blogger declared President Trump to be on the wrong side of history, deeming the United States a rogue nation that will become the pariah of the planet. British Prime Minister Theresa May is also being pressured to speak to President Trump, and French presidential candidate Emmanuel Macron has spoken out too. Nevertheless, the Washington Post reports that in the White House, the momentum has turned against the Paris Agreement. Ivanka Trump was reportedly meeting with the EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt to try and convince him of at least some of its virtues. The fate of the agreement, and in the minds of some writers the planet, may depend on a single sentence regarding whether or not a nation is required to enhance its level of contribution to carbon reductions. Another theory is to blame Charming Betsy, an 1804 Supreme Court case holding that domestic law, when possible, should be interpreted in a way that is consistent with international law. Sensing danger, both military and local leaders are speaking up. The notion that the United States might abandon its role in international affairs on climate matters has inspired strong words. There is a huge necessity that the UN continues to involve all nations and coordinate the action of all nations to fight climate change, said General Denis Mercier, NATO's Supreme Allied Commander for Transformation, as quoted by the Associated Press in The Independent. If one nation, especially the biggest nation, does not recognize a problem, then we will have trouble dealing with the causes of climate change. Of course, fellow military personnel in the United States have previously recognized the problem. Former Secretary of the Navy Ray Mabus said that climate change puts soldiers and sailors in harm's way because the Navy and Marine Corps will face more intense storms and more frequent first responder demands. Former Navy Chief Oceanographer David Titley also notes that sea level rise threatens military infrastructure. Despite the facts and consequences, green-thinking military programs like those requiring renewable energy on bases or less waste might remain at risk. Civilians are at risk too. Widespread record flooding in Missouri and Arkansas and overseas in India has people contemplating the extent to which climate change is intensifying the problem and making floods and storms worse. A new study by Michigan State University, also discussed in Forbes, warns of double danger in the double wide, explaining the deadly mix of climate change, tornadoes, and mobile homes. Rising seas and rising insurance premiums could shift from possibility to certainty. For the moment, lacking federal leadership, local governments are burdened with the responsibility to plan for this shifting future. New maps and studies of Washington, D.C., and New Jersey, and New York City, and South Florida, and the state of Virginia portray the effects of rising seas. St. Louis anticipates more flooding. Norfolk, Virginia Beach and Tidewater feel abandoned by the federal government. Trillions of dollars in real estate are at risk. Miami is nervous. A group of lawyers in the Florida bar are also thinking about the effects of sea level rise on lost property tax revenues if high-priced coastal estates go literally underwater. Other lawyers are thinking about how to create a legal framework for widespread retreat from coastal properties. In fact, Scientific American anticipates gentrification of neighborhoods with higher elevations, characterizing Miami's high grounds as hot properties. Climate change is a big economic issue too. Former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg, in a Vanity Fair interview, explained his view that cities, businesses, and individuals will help the United States achieve carbon reductions with or without the president's leadership. He offered a vision of optimism and opportunity, saying, "We have to stop talking about doom and gloom scenarios that are decades away and start talking more about the immediate health and economic benefits of fighting climate change. Reducing carbon emissions is one of the best things we can do to save lives today, reduce disease today, improve our lives today, and spur job growth today. These are things that everyone in both political parties wants." Green business leaders who share Mr. Bloomberg's views often find themselves wondering why they're forced to march at all, because they see themselves as the economic employment and innovation engines that should be favored by a jobs-focused president. Perhaps our business schools and their sustainability training have failed in their mission. That might be why some corporations might need a push. At Kinder Morgan, the shareholders, upset with their company's role in Canadian Pipeline, are pursuing new directions through corporate resolutions, and other corporations are being forced to disclose their climate-related risks. Even Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway is wrestling with resolutions concerned about climate risks. Political activism, like the oceans, is rising, but the intense partisanship remains status quo. Some observers equate the recent marches and shareholder efforts with a resurgence of radical activism. But climate change is not just a concern of the radicals. Given the local government and business considerations, pressure is coming from many directions. Organized political efforts are already targeting the climate deniers for the next election cycle. Republican leadership showing concern for climate change is emerging, and The Verge even reports that conservatives are seeking to influence President Trump by running climate change ads on television shows he watches, including Fox News and Morning Joe. And the Huffington Post took a comical view, warning the president that his other children, meaning his properties, are in danger. Meanwhile, 2 articles this week suggest that the climate policy debate has degraded into a childish game of "I know you are, but what am I?" One was in the National Review, and the other was a controversial editorial in the New York Times that induced subscription cancellations. In effect, both articles reject the label of climate denier, then citing scientific uncertainty they call the climate activists science deniers. But in truth, the uncertainty is often based on misunderstandings. For example, the LA Times and other sources can explain why the so-called hiatus in global warming was nothing of the sort. Climate change moves relentlessly forward, but the communication of uncertainty, also known as the Exxon position, continues to hinder climate change action. One report calculated that the Republican president and the 142 representatives and 38 senators who resist the consensus of climate science received contributions of nearly $83 million from the coal, oil, and gas industries. Money, of course, is also at issue in the federal budget, and for the moment, Congress has rejected the Trump administration's proposed funding cuts for environmental programs, explains the E&E News. The budget, however, did not prevent the continued deleting of climate data from the EPA web pages. Climate change is a science and health issue. No matter what EPA's webpage says or does not say, the planet is changing. Summers are hotter and dry, and lakes are getting unusually warm. As temperatures change, diseases carried by ticks and mosquitoes and highly adaptive invasive plant species are spreading. Melted Arctic sea ice means less sunlight reflection and more heat absorption in the ocean. For alpine plants and mountain ecosystems, extinction may be inevitable. Ocean oxygen levels are declining. Toxic algae blooms are expanding into fish and jeopardizing human health, and the Great Barrier Reef is bleaching again. Grapes are ripening too quickly, and warm weather diseases are threatening coffee beans. Drought is ravaging Africa, while floods in the Philippines forced people from their homes and spawned new generations of sex trafficking victims who were desperate after being forced to retreat from their homes. Although citizen editorials argue that the government is constitutionally charged with the responsibility to provide for the common defense and ensure domestic tranquility, the marching people and the climate victims are neither safe nor tranquil. Two Colorado scientists, in a thoughtful interview, explain the decline of the global atmospheric commons and the consequences. Austrian researchers think the next 10 years will be especially critical. The Guardian has sharply criticized the flawed science used by climate deniers to cloud the debate. But some scientists this week went much further, predicting imminent threats to humanity brought about by overpopulation, environmental destruction, and of course, climate change. Mr. Bloomberg had it right. With climate change, it can be hard to stay positive and focus on the message of hope. The science is stunning, and the evidence, including powerful graphics summarizing it all, is becoming overwhelming. But once in a while, science offers hope, like artificial photosynthesis. It's a long shot and far from proven yet, but some scientists are working on technology that could use the sun's energy to pull carbon out of the air and convert it to fuel. Imagine that.